At the 1889 World Exhibition, most people came to see the Eiffel Tower. But there was another attraction that people did not want to miss, and this was the royalty of the demi-mondaine, or the great horizontals, Valtesse Delabigne. She was as famous in many ways as a landmark to Paris. It's very hard for us to understand, but if you think of the Kim Kardashian, phenomenon and so on, this is virtually the same thing with a bit of culture added in. Now, she was variously known as, this was her original name, she was known when she took flight as a courtesan as Valtesse Delabigne. That's from Votre Altesse, Your Highness, all right? So it's Valtesse, and then from Delabigne, which was one word, it's Delabigne. So Your Highness, right? To which she will later add Countess, all right? Comtesse Valtesse Delabigne. She was also known for her glorious red hair, rayon d'or, the streak of gold. She was also known, because she was famous amongst the artists, as the Union of the Artists, because she knew them all, so as to speak, and also by her own nom de plume, Ego. She published her autobiography under that name. So I think this tells you something about this woman who was perfectly in sync with the end of the Second Empire, this moment of transformation that takes place in the city and also in society. And she is going to transform herself from an illiterate street urchin to being someone who was the intimate, in many ways, of the great writers, the great painters, and even one of the great politicians of the time. Now, she did this through intelligence, extreme intelligence, self-discipline, willpower, and marketing acumen. And she targeted a market which was very different from Cora Pearl. Now, you can see from the dates, she is born about 16 years later than Cora Pearl. Not that dates meant anything to these women. They sort of, were Trumpian in the way in which they manipulated them. But in other words, she's almost another generation, and she will come to full power as a courtesan during the Third Republic. This is the one which comes after the fall of the Second Empire. Now, she is going to reinvent herself as a great wit, as an intellectual, not a sort of, someone who carries on giving lectures to people in her dining room, but someone who has that sort of, knows everything. She will read books, she will study, she has a relentless sort of regime of self-improvement. And she's realised that men won't just come to her for sex. I mean, you can get that virtually anywhere, even extraordinary sort of services, which of course I have no idea about, and I wouldn't look them up on my computer, because if anything happens to me and they search my computer, the children are going to, oh my goodness gracious, all right. So I have no idea really what she got up to, but what she did get up to was the idea that she was selling an experience. It was more than just a momentary thing. She at the same time, she was ravishingly beautiful, but a beauty who quoted Voltaire and who spent thousands and thousands of dollars a day with careless luxury. So it was an experience of sort of passion, sophistication, wit. You came for the hair, you stayed for the wit. All right, so we're going to actually look at the career of this woman and the way in which she exemplifies ideas of the time, because this is actually what really, I suppose, interests me rather than just straight autobiography or straight biographies. So this is the Paris, of course, that she will inhabit, that she is going to conquer and become the sort of Her Highness of the demi-monde. This is the Paris that we looked at last week, extraordinary, made up, theatrical decors, which she will enter in her 20s, all right, because she's born the year that Napoleon III comes over as president. He will make himself emperor. By the time she's in her 20s, late 20s, he's gone. And that's really quite important for the kind of men who she's going to target and who are going to enrich her. And these are going to be the wealthy bourgeoisie, the captains of industry now, and the very, very old aristocracy, which has managed to survive the revolutions. This is the glittering heart of Paris, of course, where the Opera Garnier, which it will only be finished after the death of Napoleon III, but where she will go to every sort of opening night on the arm of extraordinary people, as we'll see, chatting to Victor Hugo, chatting to Sarah Bernhardt. So she makes herself into much more than simply a mistress or a courtesan. No one really would have taken Cora Pearl out to a soirée. All right, she wouldn't have known what to say. And anyhow, she made herself famous by her silly, spectacular pranks. Valtesse Delabigne creates this icy, aristocratic persona which intrigues. She's always almost sort of like royalty, the way she holds herself, the way she speaks. Everyone speaks of her as though she were royalty. Now, I want to look at her life, and you'll see actually what an extraordinary rise it is, and she comes from Paris. Now, this is in the Rue du Paradis, which is in the 10th arrondissement. This is what it looked like. This is what it would have looked like at the time she was born. All right, 1848, Napoleon has not started his reconstruction of Paris. These were the sordid streets with no sewerage, it stank, no footpaths, and people lived on the street. So she really was a street child who grew up in a family which had come into Paris to be, Paris was attracting already all of the families from the provinces. Now, her mother came in with a man who was her lover, who was the father of 6 children. So Valtesse has 5 other children, and they all sleep in the same bed. It's real grinding poverty that we're talking about here. The mother was a servant, was sacked, and of course then turned to part-time prostitution to keep things going, because the father was violent, was a drunken, had disappeared most of the time. So this is the kind of background that she will come from, and which will obviously, inhabit her mind much more, I suppose, than Cora Pearl had to deal with, who, after all, had been to a boarding school. This is a girl who's illiterate, right? And you have to realise how extraordinary her trajectory is. Now, her mother was aware that the eldest child, Emilie Louise, would be a great beauty because of this large blue eyes and this beautiful hair. And so she used to wake her up in the night and sort of put cold sheets on her to firm up her flesh. Well, I mean, I've tried it this morning and it doesn't, it doesn't work, I'm telling you. Anyway, she also, the reason I'm showing you this church is that Saint-Laurent was actually virtually at the end of her street. And the first appearance that we have of her is at her first communion, where she's in a borrowed dress. And she attracts attention with the whiteness, the pale, very pale skin, peaches and cream skin, beautiful hair, beautiful eyes. And she attracts the attention of someone who was 8 years older than her, who is Jules Claretier. Now, he will remain devoted to her interests. I don't know what else went on throughout her life, right up until the end. And he was not nobody, as they say in the classics. He was the art critic with the Figaro. He was also the director of the French Théâtre Français, but also he was, as you can see by his outfit, a member of the French Academy. Right, these are the immortals. So in other words, he wasn't a protector, but someone who looked after her interests. Now, the Roman philosopher Seneca said that luck is what happens when preparedness meets opportunity. And I think that this is exactly what is going to happen in the life of Valtesse de la Bigne. At the end of the street, this is by an extraordinary coincidence as well, there is the painter Corot. Now, you would have heard of this. He was one of the great landscape painters of the 19th century. He was a benevolent figure. His studio was sort of open onto the street, and he used to ask the street urchins to come in, and Emilie would go in and look at his landscapes and become entranced with this and very interested in art. So again, all of these things will be imprinted on her, and he will end up living in the same town as her at the end of her life. Now, at the age of 10, of course, her mother pushes her out. She now has to go and earn a living. It's hand-to-mouth sort of sustenance, living that we have. And she would go, first of all, to work in a confectioner's shop. Now, in the 10th arrondissement, you would, those of you who know Paris would know the passages which had been built at this time. This is the Passage des Panoramas. She would have worked in one of these little shops. And she graduated from that to working in a shop selling scarves and bits of material and hats. So there she would see wealthy ladies coming in, and sort of this envy and this idea of what she could be. People would say, oh, aren't you beautiful? But she realises that she is no way that she's ever going to be able to afford to even buy any of these bits and pieces. Now, one night when she's walking home, again, we have one of these stories. She is raped by a passerby. And in her biography, she says, "In that first journey, I saw what I did not suspect, the illusions, the naive aspirations, the dreams and hopes of my childhood. It was all gone in an instant because a brutal passerby had taken advantage of my gullibility, and society, which owed me assistance and protection, became my cruelest enemy." So she is someone who, very much like the other courtesans who rise to power, has it against men because of a violent father, violent sort of rape, probably more than one, I would imagine. She then decides that she will take up this profession that her mother had wanted her to take up anyhow, and starts frequenting balls where you can meet partners, particularly the military men. And this is on the Champs-Élysées, the Bal Mabille. And it's there that she'll meet a man, Richard Fossey, who she falls in love with, which was a bit silly, really, and has 2 children with him, one of whom will die. And he won't marry her because his family's appalled that he's with this girl who used to be a part-time prostitute, and so he heads off to Algeria and leaves her with the remaining child, with the dreadful name of Paquerette Daisy. Now she will come back into the story later on. Valtesse, who's not Valtesse yet, gives the child to her mother. And no one, and right until virtually very much the end of her career, will know, not even her closest friends will know that she had any children, all right? Because this doesn't sort of go well with this extraordinary wit who holds these salons and so on, to have a mother, at least to have the family, as we'll see, which she repudiates, and also to have had a daughter. If she corresponds with the daughter, she calls her my little sister, gives money to the mother, But there will be problems with the mother later on. I might as well tell you now in case I forget. The mother sees that this child is going to be beautiful and decides she'd put her into prostitution. Valtesse is appalled, and there's a great fight with the mother, and Valtesse takes her to court, and everyone then knows that Valtesse has a child. But by this stage she is so established as such a phenomenon that it doesn't matter. All right, so I want now, we've got her now on the path to prostitution, and I just want to pause to look at attitudes towards prostitution in the 19th century. Now, first of all, it was tolerated in France. It wasn't tolerated elsewhere, but under certain conditions. And you have this particular man whose name was Parent Duchâtelet, who wrote a book called Prostitution in the City of Paris. And I'll look at the title in a moment. Now, he would possibly be the first sociologist. All right, he started out as a doctor, and then he became a specialist in drains. And that's going to be quite important. And from drains, he goes on to prostitutes. Now, he was convinced, he was looking, what sociology does, looking at the effect on society of certain practices. And for him, prostitution was a sign of degeneracy. It was something which was hurtful to the economy, because they all had syphilis, they transmitted syphilis to their wives, there would be less members of the family, therefore less people in the army, the economy would go down, all right? So he focuses on this from this sociological point of view. And he is still considered one of the fathers of sociology, along with Durkheim. Now, this is the title of his work, About Prostitution in the City of Paris, considered in relation to public hygiene, morality and administration. Now, you can't get much more French than that. You know, administration is extremely important. So prostitution wasn't really about whether it was good or bad or anything like that. It was considered something that has to be controlled, and this was known as the French system. And he says, the necessity for, regulation. Prostitutes is inevitable in a great agglomeration of men as sewers, public infrastructure, and garbage dumps. Authority should exert the same concern for the one as the others. All right, so that's clearly where they are placed, at the bottom of humanity, simply as a facility. He considered that prostitutes were seminal sewers. That was what they were known. So I'm sorry about this, Derek, I'm sorry, but All right, so the seminal sewers are what we're going to see. And he also says the metaphor of sewer. Look, I didn't blush studying sewers. Why would I blush studying another kind of sewer, an even more ghastly sewer, I admit it, than the others? All right, now he did this by, in extraordinarily modern ways. He actually scoured the police archives and then went out and interviewed people. I mean, this was really a very modern way of looking at a phenomenon, whereas other people had looked at it from the point of view these women were immoral and so on. He saw it as part of the way in which society functions. And so the French system will be set up where these women would have to be controlled. Now, why? Well, syphilis was rampant. You just need to actually go to the Saint-Denis hospital, which was a psychiatric hospital, and every sort of alleyway is named after a famous artist, Baudelaire, Guy de Maupassant, Manet. They all died of some form of syphilis which crept up on them. And of course, they would infect their wives as well. So the women who were then in brothels these women were called soumises. In other words, they respected the law. They were registered, they had a number, and every week they had to go and have a checkup to make sure that they weren't infected. A lot of them used all sorts of ways of concealing this, but in many ways, the lower levels, and this is what is quite interesting, the lower levels of these brothels were much safer than these other women who were free agents. Now, at the same time as you get Durkheim looking and developing a sociological view of prostitution, you also have the beginning of phrenology and eugenics. Now, it was begun by Cesare Lombroso, who was an Italian, son of a rabbi actually, who studied criminology. And he said that you could recognize a criminal by their external features. You know, he went into the prisons in Sicily and said that, look, your average criminal is short and dark. And there was the same movement actually in Sweden, and they were saying, well, it's a bit funny because all ours are tall and blue. And anyway, but he established this idea that criminals and prostitutes are at a lower level of development, not in society, but in the stage of evolution. They are much closer to animals, and you can see this by their features. They have protruding jaws and so on, when we'll look at the prostitutes in a moment. This went to the point where some of you might even remember, where you'd have your skull studied and you'd have bumps, and you could tell from bumps here that, you know, you were intelligent or you weren't, or you, as you can see here, you've got caution is above the left ear, all of these different areas. But it was a very interesting idea that things happen from the outside on which you actually have no control. So in other words, it's going against the idea of the church, which is that you are born with sin and there's evil. Do you see what I mean? It's actually the beginning of a scientific way of looking at things. Now, with this, you actually get development of what is called social Darwinism. All right, now Darwin had published his, you know, Origin of the Species. Social Darwinism under Spencer and particularly Galton, who goes on to be the specialist in eugenics, was taken up by the Nazis. The idea was they were applying the ideas of survival of the fittest that Darwin had worked with animals and plants, and they were applying it to society. So this was the idea that society is a struggle and that only the best survive, and these are the ones that should go on and create the next generation. Those who do not succeed and who are weak and poor and are at the bottom of the echelon are where they should be, because they are at a lower level of evolution. And you should have no charity for these people, because if you help them, they will go on and upend this whole structure of survival of the fittest, all right? So this was a very sort of potent idea at the time, and it was applied to prostitutes. Now, according to this, again, taking up Lombroso's idea, you can tell a prostitute, I think we mentioned this last time, because they are much closer to animals. Now, going with this idea of phrenology, they have no forehead, it's sloping forehead. They are sort of fat and animal-like. Now, the best example of this, I think, is here. They have protruding jaws, all right? I don't know what he would have said about the Habsburgs, but anyway, of small foreheads, a lot of hair, all right? It's not very different, looks like me in the morning, actually, hair all over the place. They're hairy, like apes. They have no modesty. They have no morality. They tend to die young and are very frivolous, all right? So what we would now see as social conditioning is shown to be something inherent in this group of people who were at the lowest end of society. the avatar, you know, the sort of avatism, really. However, society has to be protected from them, and that is why you have these medical visits and so on. They're necessary, as Du Châtelet has said, but they have to be controlled. I think this is a very good example of that. Everyone's looking very jolly. It's just that they are a bit below the pale. Now I want to look at how you actually rise up in the ranks of prostitution. If you were unattractive and poor, you would end up in a low-class brothel. Those women who wanted to try it independently are the ones who interest us. Now, the first level would be the grisette, and this emerges in the 19th century. It comes from these little girls who were workers, right, who'd come out of the provinces, ended up sort of making hats or something, couldn't actually, you know, make ends meet, and often took a lover who would, you know, help her pay her rent. They weren't professional prostitutes. They often used to hang out with students, and were known as that. And they were called grisettes because of their grey dresses. The best example of that is Mimi in La Bohème. All right, she is a grisette. Now, the next area up, we saw this last week, was in Notre-Dame de Lorette. All right. Now, remember that this was an area where which had just been built, and the landlords wanted to rent things out cheaply. So you get this group of women known as les Lorettes. Now, they would be kept by wealthier people on a constant basis. They would change from one to another, but they're not like the grisettes who actually just did it to keep alive. All right, they're now professional women who are professional prostitutes. So here you have them here, and we are now in the area of what are called les femmes galantes. The gallant doesn't give the expression, les femmes galantes. All right, so these women made a living up in the 9th arrondissement and would gradually come down to the centre. Now, if you actually want to get a really good view of the development of prostitution, I advise you to read Zola's Nana, all right, which is about this, and we have a wonderful description of Nana flouncing down the footpaths down from the 9th arrondissement down to the centre. So there was really a geography of success of these women. Now, after those who are now, we are now looking at these women who are not controlled by the French system. They're the insoumises, those who don't obey the rules, all right? And they were much more dangerous to society from the point of view of syphilis, gonorrhea, etc., than the women who at least were controlled in the lower class brothels. They also had much better knowledge of birth control and so on. I'll come into that if someone asks me a question later. But now we have people who are professionals and who hang out towards the centre. Now, this is deliberately, this is 1874, so you will note that she has the hair, remember, made fashionable by Cora Pearl. Remember that it was a mistake, but anyhow, it becomes fashionable. Layers and layers of makeup. Fashionable, but too fashionable, everything on top of each other, and then carrying the dog. Now, the dog also becomes a symbol of theoretically middle-class nature, but also dogs were seen as dumb and docile and obedient, and all of those sort of feminine attributes. Now, these women, by the time you're getting towards the Belle Epoque, most middle-class men had got sick of the average brothel, and they liked a bit of the fun of the chase. And so you would get a whole type of prostitutes who would dress in the clothes which were now available in the big shops, all right? And it became very difficult looking at women on the streets to discern who really was who. The only giveaway is that basically if you're out there by yourself, women weren't supposed to be. So here she is actually looking like a respectable middle-class woman, and so he sort of thinks, my God, I'm such a, stud, I can seduce, she's probably someone else's wife. All right, so there was all this thrill of the chase. So these were the insoumises. Now, Valtesse didn't actually go through these stages. Now, at the top end, you also have these brothels which were famous throughout the world and in fact were in guidebooks, and where the president of the republic would take all of the ambassadors, when they arrived for the big exhibitions, the universal exhibitions. Now they were extraordinarily wealthy. This is in the Rue Chabanais. Unfortunately, I tried to get into, it doesn't exist as a brothel, but it was, it's part of the room still exist. Each room had a different theme. This one, I think, was covered in gold. There was the Indian room, there was the medieval room, there was all sorts of other rooms. There was even one room that was like being in a railway passage, a railway station, or in a train, and the fellow would sit down and then a woman would come in with a suitcase and make out she was just sitting there, and then he would seduce her. All of these sorts of, all these fantasies. This is exactly what this was. You entered a fantasy world away from your boring wife. Now, here we have the great bathtub, which was designed for the Prince of Wales, Edward VII, isn't it, who was so fat he couldn't move to do anything, so as to speak, and so they would plonk him in that bath where he didn't have to move, and everyone would do everything for him. All right, now, we get now to the very top of this chain of prostitutes, all of which exist at the same time. And don't forget, there are thousands and thousands of them, and that 95% of male population frequented prostitutes or brothels. The only 5% that didn't were probably priests. Now, we now have what is known as the demi-monde, which is an expression which is made up by Alexandre Dumas, the son, all right, to talk about this world. Le monde was actually high society, whereas the demi-monde was just, a prostitute high society. So here we have other high flyers that we haven't got time to talk about. La Paeva, who ends up starts out in the, in Russia, in a very poor Jewish girl, ends up being married to a marquis and then to a prince. Blanche d'Antigny, and I think you will agree that there is hope for all of us when you see Blanche d'Antigny, who was considered a great beauty. Then you have La Belle Otero, whose specialty was making out that she was Spanish, and she reminds you a bit of some of the dancers that you have nowadays. So they all had their specialty. She was supposed to be a great sort of interpreter of the theatre and so on. Now, why were there so many? Well, parallel to this concept of social Darwinism, these women who were at the bottom of society, there was a movement at this time which distinguished middle-class, honnête femmes, honnête, virtuous women from other women. All right, so the middle classes married. Those were arranged marriages, just as arranged marriages had worked for the aristocracy, and these women had been brought up in complete and utter ignorance of any sort of sexual ideas at all. Their reading had been, very tightly controlled. Their brothers weren't supposed to talk to them about anything. And in fact, even on their wedding night, their mother would say, now, be nice to your husband, dear. And you actually have, some people are so traumatized that they sort of never come back, or else one woman was found running down the street and so on. Now, what we have now is this representation of the ideal middle-class woman, all right, extraordinarily decorative, with nothing in her head. Now, it's interesting that you actually have the flowers where her head is, because that's basically what it is. Now, this is because science had shown that women had smaller brains than men. We all knew that, of course, you know. But the problem was that if their brain, and they thought too much blood would rush to the brain against the uterus, they would never conceive, all right? So you did not want women bothered with their little heads, bothered by education. And the feebler and more protected they needed, the more attractive they were. Now, women were supposed to be maternal, not sexual, all right? So they produced the children, looked after them. For anything else, men went to the brothels. Now, this was considered relatively normal. I mean, I don't know whether people were jealous or not. It was a completely different way of looking at relationships. I think this is very telling too. Here you have in the conservatory, you have these two sisters dressed up, and you can see the way in which they're dressed. I mean, the whole dressing of the confined bodices, the confined waist, you know, they are just simply a vision of something which is not natural. But they are actually vying for the attention of this man here who is talking to their mother. Now, over here you have a woman who is flirting in the corner. Now, the problem with going to the father going to prostitutes was twofold. One, that he would get syphilis, that would be a big problem, but worse, if he frequented one of the high flyers, would be that he would spend the daughter's dowry, all right? And if the dowry went, these women were not marriageable, all right? They were not on the market. So there were great worries about the existence, particularly of the high-flying courtesans who were known to go through fortunes in a second. Get back, you now have Valtesse. These first photos is rather sort of naively showing herself with her hair. That's obviously the, you know, the pulling point. Her beautiful hair there, which, as you can see, we'll talk about that later. Now, she has her start after going to the Bal Mabille. She is introduced to someone at the theatre. Offenbach is putting on, you know, Offenbach, you know, he was the comic opera writer of the time. You know, you get the can-can and all of these things coming out of his theatre pieces. And Orphy in the underworld, remember Orphy is in the underworld, that's where Cora played Cupid and so on. Well, you actually get, 12 years later, you now have Valtesse, who is still Emilie, who will appear singing in the row. Now, she is noted for her beauty, but not just noted by the spectators, but by Offenbach, who is 40 years older than her. And he takes her as his mistress. This goes travelling. This doesn't work very well because Mrs. Offenbach finally confronts them in a hotel foyer in Italy. There's a screaming match, and Emilie Delabigne decides that she can do better than this. And she's now, because she's been on the arm of this man who all of Paris knew, she will then go into the much higher level of prostitution, if you want to call it that, of gallantry. And she targets what she calls Brazilians. Now, the Brazilians actually meant foreigners. Now, why foreigners? Because, of course, under the Third Republic, all of the Bonapartes have disappeared. All right, there's none of the sons of generals, there's none of the family Plan-Plan, remember Duc de Morny, the emperor, they've all gone. So the people who have money are the foreign men who come into Paris, attracted by Paris, capital of the 19th century, or the captains of industry. Now, she latches on to Prince Lubomirski. These are these now you have photos which are being taken. People had, instead of visiting cards that are written, people actually had photos of themselves taken. And he will set her up in the Place, not in the Place Saint-Georges, that's actually the Paeba's house over there, but in this area. I wanted to give you an idea of how far she has come from that first view that you had of that street, the Rue du Paradis, the slums that she came from. Now, it's at this time that she will take the name of Valtesse and make her name Delabigne, and goes through his fortune within about a year, practically bankrupts him. And this is what she will do, and this is what many of them would continue to do, and will then, she by now has decided she is going to have this different persona. All right, she is now going to be sophisticated. She has now, while she's in the Rue Saint-Georges there, she's has taught herself to read, obviously. She reads constantly, you know, Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, Pascal, all of the modern writers. She devours the newspapers. She spends hours every night becoming sort of erudite, sufficiently erudite, all right, so that these people will have a mistress, as I said, who knows an awful lot about sex, but also knows a lot about Voltaire. So there's this air of sophistication. Her deportment is changed, a bit like Queen Mary of Denmark. She learns how to carry herself, puts the chin up, the back straight. I should have done it myself, actually. And has a very cold demeanour. All right, no smiling, just uses these sparkling bright eyes. And what has become known in salon circles is her extraordinary wit and her repartee. All right, so you stay for her enchanting company as well. She now moves on to something even better, and this is the old aristocracy. This is the Prince de Sagona, as you can see, a very sort of, you know, man about town, vaguely dandyish, appears, I think, in Proust, à la recherche du temps perdu. He is actually a descendant of Talleyrand, Duke de Talleyrand, and he's married to one of the Gould, you know, the Gould from the America, the Gilded Cage, the people from the wealthiest level of Americans. And she starts to go through his fortune as well. Now, he will set her up on the Boulevard Malherbe, which is just near the Parc Monceau. It's an enchanting place. Part of it's been pulled down, and you have to reconnect this. Now, Tony and I went there, and while we were waiting for the light to get right, there's a woman who came out who said she'd been a concierge there for years, and she knew that there are evidently underground passages that went from part of the centre. There's several underground passages that went into this place. Look, I didn't know whether to believe her or not, but she was, telling us all these stories. Now, when she inhabits this is built for her, right? It's no longer just renting a few rooms. She is now established, and this is built for her by the Prince de Sagona. And this is the Parc Monceau, as you see, and it is furnished in the most extraordinary way. Now, first of all, this painting, by the way, has just been attributed to Gervex. It has wonderful stained glass windows depicting some of her exploits, a beautiful pink marble staircase, hung with the most exquisite carpets, paintings by Ingres, paintings by her lovers Gervex, Détail, Courbet, and it is here that she will have the most exclusive dinners and will hold a salon. And at this salon, the great writers of the day, the great painters and the great critics of the newspapers will come to engage in this witty conversation. So in other words, even though Sagona won't be there, she's not just someone who's on someone's arm, she is a phenomenon in her own right. Now, she at this time also has this bed made for her, and it's made, and in Nana, I really do want you to read this book, it says, a bed such as never existed, a throne, an altar where Paris came to admire her sovereign nudity. Now, I'll talk about this in Zola later, but it is made up as if it's like the Louis XIV's beds, at Versailles, where you had people, with a big sort of balustrade to keep the hoi polloi out. As you can see here, it is all in gilt with V Valtesse there, the crown up here to show that she is now a countess. And she's managed also to have her family name changed in the births and deaths registered. Now that is impossible now in France, absolutely impossible. But she managed to get it, and she gets her mother's name changed as well, which doesn't really work out well. But she is sort of officially Delabigne and Valtesse. So you've got the V, and this is her coat of arms. All right, so she really takes this to a higher level. And in fact, she's acknowledged as the Comtesse de Delabigne. And in fact, Napoleon III, when he was in exile for his wife's birthday, Valtesse sends flowers, and the Empress says, oh my goodness, the aristocracy haven't forgotten us, not knowing that Comtesse de Delabigne is actually a former prostitute. All right, so this is the way in which is it. Now, I think this is interesting. This is a photo of her at the time, and obviously our concepts of beauty have changed considerably. The Cora Pearl, who was supposed to have a clown's head, I think we would consider much more attractive than her. I don't know, the head seems too big and all the rest of it. Anyway, she had a few little things up her sleeve, and this has actually recently come onto the market. You've no idea. So this is her whip with Valtesse in it here. So obviously people who were a bit bored with, the old heave-ho came down for a few quotations by Voltaire and a little bit on the side. Now, to stave off boredom, when she wasn't doing this, she decided to write her biography, and she does this under the name of Ego. And in fact, in this amazing mansion that she's had built, all of the name, she has Ego written all the way around the ceiling. And it's called Isola, and would you believe it's a story about a red-headed prostitute who makes it in Paris. It wasn't a resounding success, but she brushed that off. She thought she could do better later. Now, I now want to look at why she's called the Union of Artists. She frequents, first of all, Alfred Stevens, and who is also, paintings of this time, of course, are important. He is a very respectable salon artist, right? He's not an impressionist. She's not going to be interested in the impressionists. Why? Because they have no money. So it's only art which can embellish her. Now, he was sort of the centre of an artistic group. Here you have a woman, obviously a prostitute, because no woman would immerse themselves in a bath. I mean, girls had to have talcum powder so they wouldn't see themselves naked. So it is via Alfred Stevens, there she is again. See, I wouldn't call her a great beauty. Anyhow, she meets Gervex. Now, Gervex will do her portrait. Now, Valtesse had a system of protectors, and she had a system of 3 groups. The first group would pay a fortune, and she would be seen with them. At the opera, in a carriage, and that would cost X amount. The second group would be allowed into her bedroom, and so this would be 5 or 6 times what the first group. And the third group were those who couldn't afford it, but she calls her amant du cœur, her lovers, heartfelt lovers. And one of them who couldn't really afford it was Gervex. So she had real friendships with these men. Now, Gervex is the best painting that we have of her is by Gervex, and here you have her with the hair, the high neck as well. By now she'd actually taken on blue as her colour and violet as her symbol. Now violets, of course, were the symbols of the Napoleons, the Bonapartes, but also of Eugenie and so on. So wherever she went, she had, beautiful violet perfume. So when you walked into a room and you smelled violets, you knew Valtesse was there. It's all this sort of marketing, which was really quite extraordinary. So this is the best painting we have of her. Now, he also, Gervex became very fashionable, and he was asked to do this painting for the salle des mariages. By now, under the Republic, you have to be married at the mairie before you go to the church. All right, so you're married twice, and this is in the salle de mariage, and he has this painting, and here we have Valtesse, who is the only person looking out at us, but he's also peppered the audience with Zola, you've got Victor Hugo, you've got the Prince of Wales, you've got a Russian prince. This was a compliment to his great friend Valtesse. He was well known for scandalous paintings. This is not Valtesse. She would never allow herself to be seen in such a vulgar position. This is taken from a poem, but it caused a scandal at the time. Now, it is via Gervex, all right, who was one of the more academic painters of the time, that she will be introduced to Manet. And Manet actually asks to see her, and it is he who decides to paint her portrait. It's not Valtesse who asked to. And she goes to his, by now he's virtually crippled from a form of syphilis and will die 4 years later. But this is his beautiful painting of her. Notice that it tends to be from the side because she seemed to have a very, very wide face, which I don't think is very beautiful, but done from the profile, she is extraordinary. You can see that wonderful blue, large blue eyes, the slightly sardonic expression, the very, this is coincidental, but the very high ruffled collar, the blue, the beautiful hair, and so on. Another painter who will paint her is Jacquet. No one will have heard of him. I could not locate the original. In fact, no one knows where the original of this is. It's just a photo of it. I just wanted to have the idea of the colours it would have had. It's a painting, a photo of her at the time. She now goes into another popular area of art, and this is those who are great painters of the military. He would be one of her lovers, but the great sort of one of her, the most steady supporters and lover is Detaille. Now, he comes from a very wealthy family. He is brought up in the atelier of Meissonier, looking back at the glories of empire. This is at the Battle of Friedland and so on. Now, he also does marvellous portraits, and I think this is quite funny. Valtesse, right, she has the crown, coat of arms, but in this mansion that she has, she wants to have family portraits. And so what does she do? She gets Detaille, and Detaille does about 6 portraits of all of these people who never existed. Alphonse de la Bigne and Saint-Lisa de la Bigne, he was there, in the Renaissance. Oh, he's the black sheep of the family, and so on. And people would go through looking at this illustrious family, having no idea that all of this is totally made up, throughout. But she will maintain this right to the end. And she will, before she dies, she will make sure that these paintings of her ancestors are gifted to museums. And 2 of them were in a museum at Caen, and unfortunately were bombed during the war, and we have none left. Now, the writers. Now, this is a harder area to crack. All right, okay, there's certainly bohemian painters, there are academic painters, but the writers are a more select group. Zola asks, through a friend of his, if he could use his influence to get him into that wonderful house on the Boulevard Malherbe. And so finally, Valtesse invites him, and she expects that she will become the heroine of this wonderful book, which he is going to write. Now, Zola is someone who had no knowledge really of the demi-monde. He lived at Meudon and he hung out with laundry people and so on. So this was an education for him. So instead of enjoying the meal, all he wanted to do, he had his notebooks and he was saying how high are the ceilings, I'll measure this, I'll measure that, and all of it will go in. And that it is he who will describe, there's a whole page describing Nana's bed, which is an absolute certain description of Valtesse's bed. Now, Manet, who is a great friend of Zola, will paint Nana, but has used also other, well, for example, Blanche d'Antigny, but also Valtesse as his model, as you can see with the hair, the golden hair, the rayon d'or. So when the book finally is published, it's published in 2 newspapers, in serial form, and then when it hits the press as a novel, it's in a couple of weeks it sells 55,000 copies and is considered an extraordinary success. When Valtesse reads it, she's appalled because she thinks she's been totally had. She's invited this man in, he's done a tour of her house, and she is being portrayed as this vulgar, ghastly gutter snipe who is Nana. And she was absolutely furious and refuses to have anything more to do with Zola, and in fact, in her circles, tries to denigrate the book. She also becomes friendly with Edmond de Goncourt. I don't know if you've heard about the Goncourt brothers, who were great diarists. The Goncourt Prize for Literature exists today. It's a very prestigious prize. They were rather horrible people. They used to go to these dinner parties and then write nasty things about everybody. But for some reason, she charmed him, and he will. We actually did this book, Judy, at the Alex Chérie. He will base it on the life of Valtesse Delabigne. You can actually get that and read it. Also, another man who is absolutely besotted with her will write a book called Queen, the Sun Queen, and then fortuitously dies in a tragic duel 4 years later. So that's the kind of person he was. And also, Alexandre Dumas fils doesn't write about her, but he is the person who wrote about the Lady of the Camellias, all right? So in other words, you can see how this fascination with the world of prostitution, both in art and in literature. Now, the story goes that Alexandre Dumas fils was invited to dinner and said, oh, look, could I see your bedroom? And she said, look, I'm sorry, sir, you haven't got enough money. So that was a bit of that. Now, as I said, she wasn't obviously the lovers of these people, but she would be seen at the theatre hobnobbing with Victor Hugo, hobnobbing with Sarah Bernhardt, all right? So again, she has absolutely made it on her own terms. However, she really is much more interested in women, and we're going to actually look at this next week. She will meet Liane de Pougy, whose real name is Anne-Marie Chassaigne, and get her to change her name to Liane de Pougy, which sounds much more, aristocratic. And they will have a short liaison, which we will look at next week. I just wanted to show you the lesbian scene, which was something which was quite seen as salacious and interesting. This fellow here actually is not a fellow, it's another woman. All right, so the interesting thing about her is that she's managed to keep her books, all right? She lives with careless luxury, but she's kept her fortune. So she now owns that place at Boulevard Malherbe. She buys the Villa of the Eagles at Monte Carlo, and then will sell it to go to Ville d'Avray. Now, at Ville d'Avray, because she's decided, of course, by now, in the last 20 years of her life, she's in her 40s, you can't constantly, no matter how much cold water you throw on yourself, start to continue to look beautiful. And so with this fortune that she's amassed in jewels, in artwork and real estate, she will sell much of it and go to Ville d'Avray, just about 10 kilometres outside Paris, to the Maison de la Chapelle du Roi. Now, we actually went there, and it's completely guarded with "don't come here, don't even think about it." So, of course, I rang the bell. And they said, "Sorry, it's a private house, you can't get in." So after 5 or 10 minutes, "Oh, okay, I'll come down and get you, but you just have to look at the outside." "Oh, okay." After 5 minutes, "Well, would you like to come in?" So, but we weren't allowed to take any photos. So we saw absolutely the extraordinary sort of paintings, the Galland's paintings, which are there, and Detail had actually painted frescoes on the walls of this bill, and the people who own it now, have actually just put they've put something over because they didn't think it looked too good. Anyway, it's another story that'll come out in the YouTube. Now, while she is there, and I'll quickly go over this quickly, she finds that she is the neighbour of Léon Gambetta. Now, Gambetta is considered the father of the Republic. When Napoleon III is defeated, he's the one that stands up at the town hall and proclaims the Third Republic. He's a great orator, he's a lawyer. He dies very young, in his 40s, from a heart attack, but he, at 1881, is in charge of the Legislative Assembly and in charge of foreign affairs. Now, there's a statue to him not far from where she lived, but also he's so important to the French that his heart has been taken out and is in the Panthéon. And as you go in the stairs of the Panthéon, not underground like people like, Malraux and all the others, this is how important Gambetta is to the French. Anyhow, well, he's enchanted by Valtesse, and she actually has a lover. She has networks everywhere, who is now the consul in Indochina. And at this time, there was the big question about whether the French should continue the wars with the Chinese, the Sino-French wars. They would have lost Tonquin and Amont. And she comes in, she says, "I've got all this information from this lover of mine who's given me on-the-ground information." Gambetta says, "Well, look, really, okay, look, if you do have this, write me something." And she writes a huge sort of submission, which he actually submits to the Foreign Affairs Council. And they come back and say, what you should do is publish this. So Valtesse Delabigne's petition for the French to keep Tonquin is published in 2 newspapers. So in other words, she's really now dabbling in politics. In the end, the French do decide to keep Tonquin and Amont. Now, whether it was due to Valtesse, I don't know. I'm sure there are many other reasons, but just to show you that she dabbles in this. Well, after 20 years, she's installed Detail, her faithful lover, in a studio in the grounds, which this lady who now owns it sort of thinks is possibly a dovecot, but I don't think it is. But she suffers from a burst vein or something. I can't understand how you can do that. But anyway, her days are numbered, and she realises this. Now, she is 62, but she has managed to alter her birth certificate so that in the papers it will go out that she's 48. However, right to the end, this is the kind of woman that she was. She had her, when you died, I don't know, maybe when you still do die, she had papers that would be sent out to people to alert them of the death. And she had this beautiful paper set up with sort of Gothic writing, and she has, Madame Valtesse Delabigne died on, remember, with the date blank. And when the doctor came in and said, you've only got a couple of hours or a day, she gets out her pen, puts in the date and addresses these envelopes and dies. And so the next day people would open it, they thought it was a prank, but indeed it wasn't. So that's sort of like the kind of woman that she was, of course with Gothic printing, because that's what, royalty had. Now, her funeral will be held, 4 white horses carried out with a very, severe coffin with violets on the top. Detail has been given the instructions, people, local dignitaries to come. Her family is not to be there. If they arrive, they are to be sent away or kept as far away as possible. Her sister now had managed to sort of chime in on the idea of royalty and called herself Marquise and had started up a brothel in the Rue Blanche. So Madame Valtesse Delabigne, who is totally above all this, I mean, brothels, my goodness, does it exist, would not want them there. So she is buried in, she's already designed, this is a terrible photo because it actually has been demolished when we actually got to the cemetery. This is all that's left. This has been demolished, but it's got eagles and it's got a flame up the top with V's and everything. And she's buried there, but there's also 2 names of 2 men that no one knows who they are. So right to the end, she's kept this idea of mystery alive. However, this is the woman we've been talking about, who went from rags to riches, and she now sells everything off, gives her bed to the Art Décoratif in Paris, you can see it there, sends most of her paintings, in fact, even that portrait by Gervex, to the Musée du Luxembourg, it'll then go to the Louvre, and then we'll end up in the Musée d'Orsay. And so all of these things are dotted throughout the country. Even the little church that we went into at Ville d'Avray has paintings by Corot, which she donated. But the stipulation was that it had to be, underneath, had to be a gift of Valtesse Delabigne. Now, the funny thing is, well, not funny, is that her daughter marries, that is relatively respectable, and then has a daughter who's André Lafayette, who then goes to America and becomes a real film star in the silent movies, terms herself as André Lafayette. She was actually Fosse, and marries another film star. She doesn't really make the transition very well into the spoken movies, falls out of fashion a bit, and then resurfaces as the mistress of the Duke of Edinburgh's father. And in fact, when the Duke of Edinburgh's father dies, the person who meets the Duke of Edinburgh to usher him into her father's quarters is no one else but the Comtesse André de Labigne. So maybe there is something with survival of the fittest. Now, really getting back very briefly just to the concepts of survival of the fittest that was being spread at the time, it could not be more apt than in relation to the courtesans. They rose from nothing to extraordinary powers and stayed there if they knew how to. So, thank you very much.